Hello, everyone. Happy afternoon.
Happy afternoon.
Thanks, Kat.
Hi, how's it going?
Good. How are you, Jen?
I'm doing all right. I've got more coffee, so I'm all set.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
But if you guys ever watch me right about 2, 3 o'clock, there's another cup of coffee in my hand, almost always.
I feel like
What's
I
that
drink
you got
less
right
coffee
there?
being at home now than I do when I'm actually in an office.
That should be one of our prompts, like how many cups of coffee a day are you drinking?
Oh no,
Here,
no,
here.
I don't want to answer that question.
Actually, the worst question for me would be how much caffeine do you consume in a day? Because this is my other horrible. So yeah, I think that would be really bad.
Yeah.
So Meg, I have an espresso machine at home. It's just getting more use now. So yeah.
Okay, but tell me more about this espresso machine.
Mm.
I want to know all the things.
It's a Jura. I can't remember the name of it. It's something 5. It's
Okay.
the J5. I can't remember what the hell it's called. So it's an automatic. It has a little thing at the top. Largely pull shots. It will make a cup of coffee. That only gets used when my parents are here. Because trying to teach them about how we got coffee out of espresso and how an Americano is the exact same thing as coffee, just in a weird order. I learned a lot about coffee living in Seattle and meeting my now husband.
I feel like this is a hobby spike that maybe should happen.
Totally.
Yeah,
Probably.
I would watch that.
I would too.
Could do that.
You could probably give it.
Yeah. All right.
I could.
Awesome, y'all. So this afternoon we're gonna talk about mocks and stubs, and this is something that I wanna start this lesson just by kind of saying that this topic of mocks and stubs is something that we used to not teach very much of at Turing, and then as people started getting into their jobs and came back to Turing, they mentioned, it would have also been nice to know about mocks and stubs. It's something that they use in the job quite frequently, and we'll talk about reasons why it's used frequently. And I think as you actually go throughout the mods, you'll use mocks and stubs a lot more than you do in mod 1. But we do want to give you just an introduction to them. And I say all this right now because I feel like a lot of times, at least when I'm a student, no matter what school I'm in, and you all, I'm sure, are feeling this too, like there's so much information that's thrown at you and so much to digest. And this is one of those things where I want to say, if at the end of this lesson you feel very overwhelmed and this was a little too much, it's okay to put this on the back burner for right now. But it is something that I want you all to feel comfortable with, like, okay, I've heard of it, I have an idea of what it does, I might not know exactly how to use it, but I'm kind of familiar. So all of that said as well, as far as this being, but obviously we're going over this in mod 1, it is not something that you need to know in order to get promoted to mod 2, but you will see in the projects going forward, especially the group project, I believe, the rubric has to get a 3 on functionality or get a 3 on testing, you have to use at least 1 mock or stub. And then same thing for a 4 to utilize multiple mocks or stubs. So it will be in like the project grading, but again, it's not essential that you know it in order to go on to mod 2. Okay. All right. So to warm up, before we kind of get into like what is a mock, what does it mean to stub something, I want y'all to just on your own think through these 3 questions that I have up here. So this will be, like I said, on your own in your journal. First one, thinking back to your first 2 projects. So the project you're currently working on and the one that you finished your first week here. Was there any functionality for which you could not write tests? Second one, can you think of any scenarios where a method would return an unknowable value? So something that might be generated based off of user response or something like that? Can you think of any scenarios like that? In the real world, outside of coding, what does it mean to actually mock something? So let's take, I'll put 4 minutes up here. Let me make my screens a little different right now. 4 minutes on your own. If you would like to turn your camera off during this time, you are welcome to. All right, so does that sound go through for you all? Okay, cool. Awesome. So let's think through these questions. I'm going to go ahead and call in some volunteers here. Let me make this a little bigger. That's fine there. Okay. Hannah. So thinking back to your first two projects, was there any functionality for which you could not write tests?
Yeah, some of the user responses, so like where they were placing their ships, we couldn't test for that.
Yeah, cool. And I think I kind of mentioned that too, I think in number 2 a little bit too, but you're right. Having anything that had like user response, that was hard to test. And we even told you like, don't worry about testing that, right? We haven't really learned about mocks or stubs, and mocks and stubs are a good way to be able to test those things. It's not the only way to test some of those things. Yeah, great. Anyone else, and you can just raise your hand for this. Anyone else add anything else for this first question?
No.
Joshua?
When an object such as a class hasn't been created yet.
When it hasn't been created yet. Can you expand a little bit more on that?
Sorry, an object that you need hasn't been created yet. So if your partner is working on something that's ahead of you, and your tests require like pulling information from that object. So yeah.
So are you saying you wouldn't write tests for those things, or that would be a good time to use a mock?
That'd be a good time to use a mock.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree with you. And we'll kind of go into those like best case scenarios, but I would agree with you right off the bat there that that would be a great time to use a mock or a stub. Hope?
Also methods that require user response, like with gets.
Yeah, so anything that had like a gets.chomp, right, would have been something nice to be able to kind of stub out, or something that like you weren't able to test.
Or was that already mentioned?
I think kind of an iteration of it was mentioned, but that's fine to say again.
So how about methods that pick random choices?
Yeah, I like that too. Something that could be randomized, and you don't really know what it would give you back. That's hard to test something that would be random. And I think that kind of goes into the second question here. Can you think of any scenarios where a method would return an unknowable value? We had that like user input, a user could put in anything. Hope also just mentioned something that could be random. We don't necessarily know what might get generated by something that's random. So that could also be another time where you don't know what to test. And then how about this third question here? In the real world, outside of coding, what would you say it means to mock something? Mike?
Like to mimic something.
Yeah. Sorry, did you say something else?
Yeah, to like represent something through like a imitation or something else.
Cool, I like it. Yeah, so to mimic or to represent something through imitation, I'm just gonna put word for word what you just said. How do I spell it? Mimic. Through imitation. I'm not gonna change my, well, I'll change this one. There we go. So mimic or represent something through imitation. Awesome. Great. I want to keep with that idea of like, that's what it means. That's what we can kind of like say what it means based off of our understanding of mock. And very similarly, that's going to be the same definition we use when describing what a mock is when it comes to testing. So to do this and to kind of go through this lesson, I want to start off right away just with like getting into some examples. And the examples that we're going to get into are in that Bob Ross repo that I sent you all. If you have not cloned that down yet, that's totally fine. I'm going to go through 2 examples with you all and then give you time to try a third example out on your own. So at that point, if you'd like to clone it down, you're welcome to do it then as well. So getting into mocks and stubs, let's go ahead and pull up this Bob Ross repo. Get out of here. Make sure I'm in there. Yes, cool. All right. So let's kind of, some of you may have like taken a look at this already, which is fine. Some of you, this could be the very first time you're seeing this. So I want to kind of go through what we have here in this repo. So we have, in our lib folder, we have a Bob class. We also have a paint class. And so we have tests for each of those classes in our test folder. Taking a look at our paint class, and we can see here's our paint test over here. Is this big enough for everyone to see? Anyone need this a little bigger? So taking a look at this paint class here, paint test here. We're testing this paint class over on the left-hand side. There's something in here that we don't normally see. Some of you, I think, I saw some people put this into some games that they play to make it look like their computer's thinking or something like that. But what this sleep does is it literally just like pauses your application and waits for however many seconds you tell it to wait. And so this is kind of my way of showing you all a class that I would call is expensive. Any ideas? What do y'all think I mean when I say a class or code is expensive? You can raise your hand on this. Taylor, what do you think? What do you think I mean when I say that something's expensive?
I would assume that you're talking about like very resource heavy or uses a lot of memory.
Yeah,
perhaps.
Uses a lot of memory, resource heavy. Any other ideas? Hope?
Something that takes extra time or a lot of time.
Yeah, something that takes extra time. That's kind of what I'm hitting at here. When we say that something's expensive, I think I kind of tend to lean towards like two different ways of explaining this. And I think that the time goes into the way that Taylor, you also described it. Like if something requires more resources, it's going to take longer to process. And so really we're kind of getting back to this idea of time. If something is going to take a long time, time is money. And so we say that that's expensive, right? We can also think of it from an actual money perspective. Let's say, and this is something that we don't really talk about much in Mod 1, but just to give you an idea of why something could be expensive. Let's say for this paint class, when I called paint.new, I create this color attribute. I also create an amount attribute. And then I also want to call out to another server somewhere else, maybe gather information from an API, which is something that if you don't really know much about right now, that's totally fine. It's something that in Mod 2 and Mod 3, you'll definitely talk a lot more about. But really what it is just a way to get information from other servers. So you have to go somewhere else to get information, and then you have to wait for a response from that server to get that information back. So let's say in this paint class, I want to create this color attribute, this amount attribute, but I also want to call out to a certain server and see what shops have this color and get that information back and store shops in here. Like maybe I wanted something in here that said like shops, and then I would have to go get something from another server to be able to populate what the shops are for this paint. That might take some time. And also when we think back to, okay, well, money, like this might be money too. A lot of times with these APIs or when you call out to another server, there's what's called rate limits. And so those rate limits are kind of dependent on, more often than not, they're dependent on how much you pay for access to that. So the more frequently you hit that server, the more it actually might cost you money amount, dollar amounts. So time and literal money is what could possibly make your code go slower. So since we don't really know how to call out to APIs right now, I put this little sleep in here just to simulate that, okay, this is something that might take a long time. If we were to run this test, let's go ahead and run this paint test. We can see just even before I run this, I want y'all to think to yourselves, how long do you think this test is going to take to run now that in my initialize method, I put a sleep of 2 seconds? I'm going to go ahead and run it. There we go. Okay. So finished in 8 seconds, around 8 seconds. We can see that everything's passing. This did take some time, right? So every single time in my test that I call this paint.new, which gets to my initialize method, it sleeps for 2 seconds. And I call paint.new in this whole test file 4 times. So 2, 4, 6, 8, about 8 seconds that this test took to run. So this is costing me time. It's also costing your company time if they've kind of hired you to write this feature or something like that. So to get past something that takes a lot of time, that's when we use mocks and stubs. So let's take a look. This one's all passing, and I would say that the paint class is expensive. We need to test it to make sure that it works. So this test itself might be long, but other tests later that might be integration tests that use the paint class, those might benefit from using mocks and stubs, so that not every single test is slow. Maybe just the paint test is slow, but other tests that use paint objects can go a little bit quicker if we use mocks or stubs. So I know I'm saying a lot of words at y'all right now. Let's go ahead and put this into action and take a look at the Bob test and our Bob class. Cool. All right. So right now, if I were to just run my Bob test, let's go ahead and run this just to see how long it's taking us right now. Okay, we got 2 tests passing, 4. Oops. Okay, so in 12 seconds, we can see here it took this test to run. And everything's passing right now. But I want to try and make this a little bit quicker. So even just taking a look at this test, we can see that within this test, there are a few paint objects that needed to be created, which is what's making this pretty slow right now. And since I'm not necessarily testing the paint class here, I'm testing the Bob class, but I'm using paint objects to test the Bob class, I'm going to think that I'm going to use some mocks in here to make this go a little bit quicker. How we're going to use mocks is we're going to take in, just similar to how we require Minitest Pride or Minitest Autorun, a library for Minitest. We're also going to bring in a library from Mocha. And so this is going to give us access to mock and stub methods. So I'm going to require Mocha, and then there's a module in Mocha called Minitest. So Mocha specifically for Minitest is what we want to require in here. And this is all kind of written out in the lesson plan as well. So if you wanted to implement mocks and stubs in a project, you can always come back to the lesson plan to see what do you have to require. But this is what you can require when you're using Minitest and trying to mock anything out. Will?
Could we call Mocha without calling Minitest, or do you have to call Minitest and Mocha?
I believe you could, but I think then you're just requiring more files than what you need. So I would really only require what you do need for this. All right, I'm going to go ahead and.
For clarity, sorry, I meant like,
Yeah.
could you get rid of those first 2 lines in this, but still call Mocha/Minitest and have it work?
Get rid of the first 2 lines here.
Yeah.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So this Mocha Minitest, that's coming from a completely different gem than this is coming from. So this is coming from the Minitest gem. This is coming from the Mocha gem.
Okay, so you could just have a Mocha line if you just want to do Mocha related tests.
Okay, so the Minitest, I think I can kind of understand what you're saying. The Minitest gem is responsible for kind of like the setup of all of these tests, like making sure that we have access to Minitest here. But this Minitest, this Mocha Minitest, is just giving us access to methods that we can use to mock and stub in Minitest. So it's not necessarily giving us the Minitest library, it's just giving us access to tools that we can use for Minitest.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, good question. All right, so I also, in addition to requiring it here, I also need to install that gem, just like the very first time that we required Minitest, we installed Minitest. So in here, I'm going to go ahead and run gem install Mocha. And we can see that that got installed all right. Cool. So now I've installed the gem. I'm saying right in this test here, make sure that you require Mocha Minitest. And now I'm able to start mocking and stubbing. So starting with this idea of mocks, let's go ahead. let's jump to the first test that actually uses these paint objects, right? This is what's slowing our application down or our test down. So these up here, I think those are fine to go. Those are testing our Bob class. It's not really requiring paint objects to be able to test them. So I'm going to jump down to this test. And I think for now, I'm just going to skip every other test in the meantime and just focus on this one right here. So in this test, it can have paints. Let's take a look at like, what is this actually trying to do? So we have a new Bob object that's created, saved into this variable Bob. And then we have two paint objects that we created. And we're checking to make sure that when we call add paint on a Bob object and pass it a paint object, that when we call bob.paints, we can see that that got shoveled into an empty array, which was that paints attribute. So looking over here, we have this paints attribute, and we want to test this method here, add paint. When we pass it something, it gets shoveled into this paints array. Something that we've seen quite a lot before. So the thing with this test right here, it doesn't necessarily matter if we have a paint object. Really what we're testing is that this method, add paint, is able to take something in and shovel it into something else. That's really all we're testing. So in this case, having a paint object is not necessary. What we can do instead is we can make an object still, but we're going to make a mock object. So there's a few different ways you can do this. The way that I like to do it is you say mock, right? This is automatically going to create a mock object, just this keyword mock right here. But then you can also pass it something to help it be a little bit more descriptive for you. So I might say in here like paint object 1 is what I'll call this mock object. And just to kind of prove that you can do it two different ways, I'm just going to call mock on this one. So right now, let me go ahead and put a pry in here and run this test. Okay, we can see it didn't take 2 seconds on these two. We're not calling paint.new. Let's go ahead and move down a little bit. And so right now at my pry, if I take a look at paint1, I can see paint1 is an object. It's a mock object is what it's saying that like class is, a mock object. And then it took whatever I put in the string here and it kind of, instead of having a regular old object ID, it puts this name that you give it. If I take a look at paint2, which I didn't pass it anything, then it just generates a random ID for it. It does not really matter what the ID is because this truly is just a dummy object. It just is a thing. It's not the paint object that you originally created here, but it's just a regular object that holds nothing. But we can pass it around and we can have it kind of act like an object. So 2 ways to create it. You can either pass it something to be a little bit more descriptive, or you can just call mock. That's fine too. And now when we get to this bob.addPaint, we're going to pass it a mock object. And same thing here, passing it a mock object. And then we want to test to make sure that those 2 objects got into that array all right. We can even try this out over here. If I were to say bob.addPaint paint1, I can see there that it went into this array. I can see if I do bob.addPaint paint2, now I have both of those mock objects in there. And if I take a look at bob.paints, I can see that that's kind of what I'm expecting. I passed 2 objects in and those got put into the array for paints. So I'm going to go ahead and jump out of this pry. And my pry is out in my code. Let's go ahead and run this one more time. And we can see that that passed. We still have those 2 skip tests down there, but really I can just mock something out here because I don't really need to have a paint object in order to test this functionality of being able to add an object to an array. What questions do y'all have right now seeing your first mock object? Curtis.
So in this particular example, it doesn't seem like you would even need a mock. You could just put like anything in there.
Yeah.
So why bother with like all the trouble of setting up mocks?
Yeah, that's a great idea. So great thing to mention too. So you're saying we could just put whatever we wanted, right? And just make sure that that came back, because anything in Ruby, right, is an object. So if we just ran this, that works too. And that could be another way that you test it. So that actually would be fine. I mainly, Curtis, for this example, wanted to show you just like what a regular mock object looked like. A lot of times mocks require you to stub something on them. So we'll get to that stubbing functionality after this.
Okay.
But you're right, that this could have been done just with like a regular string.
Okay, yeah, I assume that there's like more things you can do with it. I was just wondering like what the nuance is, like when you would use it versus like, but if we'll get to that, I'll wait.
Yeah, no, I think that's good that you mentioned that. It would have been totally fine to do something like that. Just, I could even have said here like paint 1, and then called this one paint 2 or whatever. And that takes up a lot less time than creating a paint object. It's still treated like an object in that I can pass it in and make sure that it gets into this array. But if I ever, which later on we will, if I ever want to test that a certain method works on that paint object, then I would have needed it to be mocked so that I can stub out methods later. Other questions right now? Will?
You may get to this, but so what if you wanted to mock something that had attributes?
Yes, we'll get to that.
Thanks.
All right, let's go ahead. Let's take a 5-minute break. And when y'all come back, we'll get into some of those questions that Curtis and Will just had. See y'all then. Oh, let's see if we can get music on. Like you're like, yeah. Okay, welcome back. Let's go ahead and jump into this next example here. All right, so we got through this first one, test it can have paint. Let's go ahead and unskip this next one. This one also is kind of an expensive test, right? We're calling paint.new twice. That's going to take a long time. Maybe it calls out somewhere. Maybe it's costing us money to hit that API. So I don't want to test it, or I don't want to call it here. So I think I'm going to go with that same idea above of mocking out those paint objects. But let's first take a look at, what did I change in here? Oops. Oh, that was block test. Okay. So let's take a look at what is this test even trying to test. So test it can return colors. So I have my bob object. I have these 2 paint objects. I'm adding those paints, which I've already tested that works just fine. I can add objects into an array. And then when I call bob.paintColors, I want it to return an array of those paints colors. And again, looking back to the paint class, paint has this attribute called color. So now we're getting to this idea that a few of y'all have brought up of, well, why would we mock something when we can just pass it a string and test that it works the way that we wanted it to? And I'm going to leave it that way up here because that is one way to do it. But now we're getting into something where it is necessary that we mock something and create mock objects so that we're able to call methods on an object. So in this example here, again, pull up Bob class. I want to go ahead, I'm going to comment these out for now, and I'm going to replace them with 2 mock objects. So let's say paint1 is equal to mock, I'll just call this paint object 1, And then let's do the same thing for paint 2. So 2 mock objects. I'm saying add both of those mock objects. We saw that that worked before. But now I want to test this bob.paintcolors and make sure that I get this array back. Let's go ahead, let's run this and just see what we get from it. We're getting 1 failure. And let's see, so tested can return colors. That's the test that's throwing this failure. And we're getting, here's our failure message. Unexpected invocation, mock, this like mock object, mock paint object 1 dot color. So it's unable to call this dot color method on this mock object. This mock object does not know a method called color. So this is where stubbing comes into play. When we talk about stubbing something, it's kind of like overwriting is a way that I would say it, overwriting the return value you would expect from a certain method. And a lot of times you stub something when you've already tested that it works somewhere else. For example, we already know that the paint class that we can call paint1.color on a paint object and get an attribute back. So we already know that with paint objects, this works just fine. But over here in my Bob test, since I had to mock the paint objects to be able to save myself some time, these are no longer paint objects. So they no longer respond to the attribute or the method .color. So this is where that stubbing comes into play. So right after I mock them, and I guess I'll mention also here, there's a lot of different ways syntactically that you can stub something out. I'm going to show you one way to do it today. If you find different ways to do it, that's totally fine. But just know there are a lot of other ways to write out stubs. But I think the way that I'm going to show you today is a little bit more readable. So that's why I'm choosing to do it this way. So for the paint1 object, I want to stubs plural, stubs out a method. And so the method that I want to stub out, or the method that I want to say like, hey, mock object, anticipate this getting called on you. And when that gets called on you, return this. So paint1.stubs, the method that I'm going to stub out is color. And when I stub that out, I want it to return alizarin crimson. So paint1, when color gets called on you, return this. We take a look over here at the actual paint colors method. So taking a look over here, we can see that every single time that we iterate through our paint objects, in our case from our test, they're mock objects, we call that dot color on paint. So that's where this is all coming from. So after stubbing that out, let's go ahead and run this again. We still have 1 failure. And let's see what we're getting here. So allowed any number of times, invoked once. So let me go to the top. Tested can return colors, unexpected invocation. This one's on paint object 2.color. So it seemed to be okay with that first one. We didn't yet stub out color for paint 2 mock. So we need to do that for paint 2 as well. And for paint 2, we'll go ahead and type that in. That's what we're expecting. And let's go ahead and run this again. And now those are passing. So we've told our mock objects, I kind of think of it like, okay, this mock object that we've declared on lines 34 and 35, they're going to be used in our code. We have them now, after we've added them, we have them in this like @paints array. And whenever we call paint colors on it, paint colors goes through that array of objects. And for each element of the array, it calls .color. Since we already have tested in the paint class that paint objects return to .color the way that we would expect them to, it's okay to stub this method out elsewhere if you have a mock object for that paint class. So that's what we did here. We stubbed out the method color, the attribute color, to be what we would expect it to return or what we want it to return. And then we check here that that method paint colors works as we would expect it to. Any questions, or who has questions? Joshua.
So I guess I'm struggling to see the value in this, because it seems like you're kind of just hard coding your results through the mocks and stuff. So I guess I'm struggling to see like why go through this process.
Yeah, okay, so let's take a step back then, kind of back to this paint colors method. What would you say, Joshua, what would you say the functionality is of paint colors?
So it's iterating through that collection and printing out the array of colors.
Yeah, it's printing out an array of colors, which those colors are attributes on the paint class. But we already knew from that other test, our paint test, that we can call .color off of a paint object just fine. And we've already tested that that works. In our actual code, like when we're let's say we deploy this and we're using this exact code, we're never going to have mock objects in our actual code, but we're testing with mock objects because the actual paint objects are expensive. So what this paint colors method is doing is it's testing that when we have a collection of something, that our method here can iterate through that collection, call a particular method on each of those elements, and get back a string. It does not necessarily matter what the object is, because we already know that that paint object works, that it can work. But since it does take a lot of time, we can mock it and stub it out since we already know that this stuff works. Does that kind of make sense, Joshua?
Okay, yeah, I think it's getting clear. Yeah.
Okay. Jake.
Maybe kind of as a clarifying point. So like you used like 2 seconds as a sleep, like something could take longer than that, I'm guessing. So like, let's say you have 30 seconds for everything, and Joshua, you're trying to test all this and it hits 30 seconds every time. So you're just sitting there for like minutes on end while this is running. To, I guess, broadening the time might help understanding a little bit. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you all might start seeing this a little bit more in your next project. You can think about, so in this next project that you're going to have, not to look too far ahead, but you will be pulling in a lot of information and creating a bunch of objects from that information. So let's say for each of your tests, you had to like go and download information, or like go pull in a file and convert them all to objects for every single one of your tests. So if you were going to run that, that might take a long time. Whereas if you could just kind of like mock and stub out the return value of reading from a file, then that would be a lot quicker. Sean.
Can you help me think about how this works with like choosing random? Because it seems like we'd hard code a specific thing in there rather than getting like a random string.
Yeah, so random is actually, so are you thinking, Sean, kind of like the random method in Ruby, or just anytime something's random?
I think more broad, anytime anything is random. In particular, we use like a dot sample, which grabs like within the list a random one out of there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think actually I might put that question, Sean, on hold, because the activity you're going to do in a little bit works with a random example.
Oh, great, thanks.
Yeah. Who else has questions right now? Curtis.
So this may be me thinking about like TDD incorrectly, but like it seems like that would create, like if you had something break in Paint, it seems like it would hide that. It was like broken in the Bob Ross.
Mm-hmm.
So does that mean it makes the test less robust, or like is it just like, does it make it clearer to find where the broken thing is? I don't know.
So mocking and stubbing this out in the Bob class doesn't affect your paint test later. So you would still always want to make sure that your paint test is continually working. Like this might pass, and let's say you're right, maybe something broke in the paint class, but then your paint test shouldn't be working. And then you can go back and check there. But I guess the two reasons why I would frequently use, let me think what I'm trying to say here.
Is it fair to say that you're testing paint in the paint test, so you don't really need to test paint in the Bob test, so you can stub it unless you're doing something that changes an attribute of the paint?
Yeah, I think with these mocks and stubs, we're using them because we know that it already works, but we also know that it takes a lot of time. So going back frequently to other tests that you've written is important so that you can make sure that those tests are still always passing while you continue to use mocks or stubs elsewhere. Does that make sense, Curtis?
Yeah, that does. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, Jake?
Yeah, so basically anything you're using mocks and stubs with will be tested and run like the correct way in some portion of your test.
I would say, okay, so here, yes, but here's the caveat too. Another reason why you would use a mock or stub is because let's say you're working on a paired project, which y'all might be doing right now, and you tell your partner, hey, can you go make this class with that method? And you're expecting your partner to make something. And that way that doesn't kind of stop you from making from implementing your code. You can kind of write your code as if you're going to get that method later. It might not be something that you've already written and have already tested, but you might have a mock and stub because you're expecting your partner to create that functionality and that you'll receive it later. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. Yeah, I would say like those two reasons. Either you already know it's passing or you know you're going to get that functionality from someone else. Let's go ahead to Joshua.
So is the idea that once that functionality exists, then you refactor your test to include the actual object or methods?
I think that's up to you and whoever you're working with. I would also think though that if you're getting that from your partner, that they've already tested that on its own. So it would be okay to keep your mock and stub.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Hope?
So how would we stub a method that gets input from the user?
Good question. We'll get to that example too. So we'll put that on hold for right now. All right, last question, and then I'm going to put you on to some practice groups for this last test. Jesse?
We may get to this, Meg, but can you pass multiple arguments to the returns method in the event that you don't know exactly which of two, I guess, strings you'll get back from calling a method? Does that make sense? Are there situations in which you could test for a couple different responses?
So you would more or less just use it to pick one of those and then say that it returns that.
Yeah, so I think with this stubbing, it is to specifically return one thing. And I think that with kind of where are you thinking more along the lines, Jesse, of like something that could be random and could be chosen or could be returning more than one thing?
I'm not sure I know the exact context of where it would happen, but I'm just thinking if we're expecting one of two responses from or return values from calling a method, can we pass those two return values into the returns method?
Not that I know of. The main
Okay.
purpose of this, so I think what you're kind of getting along the lines of like is if you wouldn't know which, like it could be one of two, then I would test like for one time, return one of those two things and then test what you need to test. And then for another test, return the other of those two and then test what you need to test. So like if something could have two possible outcomes, then stub it out to have those two different possible outcomes, but in separate tests.
Okay, thanks.
Yes. All right, let's go ahead. I'm gonna put y'all into breakout rooms, and what I would like y'all to do is try and use a mock and a stub for this last test. If you have not been following along and coding along with me, that's totally fine. I did not expect y'all to do that. So what you can do is once you get this cloned down, just skip these first two tests since you don't have the code that I just put in there, and just run your test so that this is the one that you are working on. And as far as working style that I would like y'all to kind of follow during these breakout rooms, once I put you into those breakout rooms, if you can each pull this down, work on it separately. No one really needs to share their screen, but I want you all to be in a group so that you at least have like a small group that you can ask questions to. But we're not really going to do driver navigator on this. Everyone's working on their own computer, and you have a small group available for questions if you have them. Does that make sense? Or any questions I should ask on how we'll do that? All right, I'm going to go ahead and open up these breakout rooms, and I'll see y'all back in a few minutes. Okay, let's go ahead. I want to see if we can have one volunteer to possibly share your screen and go over how you did this. And then once we wrap up with that volunteer, we'll go ahead and take a 5-minute break. So by show of hands, anyone interested in sharing their screen for this? John, first one.
Yeah, so I hate volunteering, but
I knew that, which is why I got excited and asked you right away.
Boo. I only volunteered because I actually got it this time, which was very exciting to me.
Well, go ahead and explain to us, John, what you did.
Sure. So for the mock, I just put in the same names that you used because I wasn't creative. The stubs was where it got to me a little bit. I was a little bit confused as to what to put in here. But what I realized was that in order to get this total paint amount, I need the amount attribute from the paint class, which is accessible via adder reader. However, I couldn't access that information due to the fact that this is not a thing. It's a made up thing that I made or mocked. So I jammed it in there by making the amount return the corresponding amounts that are given via argument and what it's supposed to be. And when I put that in there, the test ran and used these values, stubbed in these values for the amount, and it gave me a passing test.
Nice. Awesome. Great job, John. Any questions? Actually, John, can you leave your screen up just while people are taking a look at that?
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Does anyone have any questions on what John did here? Sydney?
So I don't have a question on what he did. I just have a question on how it's adding. Like, how is it taking the sum of those two things? Because I got there and then I was like, okay, now how do I add them? Like in my brain, I wanted to do, you guys know I want to do more than I need to do. I make it complex. So how is it adding it? That's my question.
Yeah. John, do you want to answer that?
Sure. So this method is still, it exists and it was written. So we're not actually messing with the method itself. However, this method will not run without the mocks or the stubs because it doesn't have values. So all we're doing is using the same method, which is here, total plus equals paint.amount. And then we just gave it the amounts by stubbing them in.
Okay. So basically I'm just using this to access this method over here with big data.
See.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay.
Awesome. Great explanation, John. Garrett.
Yeah, so I understand like this one that we had to do in terms of making this stub. What I'm curious about is, for example, and maybe this would never happen, but like let's say we were testing here and we had to use like multiple different methods that were calling, like we had to basically call the amount and the color and the dot color. Like, can you create multiple different stubs to use simultaneously like that? Like use dot, or like the, basically set the amount to return a specific value, and then also set the dot color to return a specific color simultaneously?
Yes. Yeah, you can stub out as much as you need to stub for that mock object. And there, like I said, there's different syntax that you can use where you can like do it all on one line. But really what you're kind of mentioning right now, I would, if you needed to stub out the color method, I would just on line 54 of that Bob test that is up right now, I would just say like paint1.stubs color dot returns alizarin crimson.
Cool. So you just do multiple different lines and just add them. Okay.
Yes. Yep. That's one way to do it. That's how I would do it for now. Great. Who else has questions? John, great job explaining. Thank you for sharing your screen. Will, question?
Yeah, on our team, Jesse discovered that stub might be a reserved word. Is there a functionality behind that we'll later get to? Stub singular versus stubs, or is that just a typo?
I think that there's another, I think it comes along with a different syntactical way to do it, but okay. I've only used stubs. Okay. I'm not too sure on that one. Okay, let's go ahead then. Let's take 5 minutes. I'll put my screen up and share a timer with you all. So let's say 2:16-ish that you'll be back. Share screen.
Sometimes I feel like throw my hands up in the air. I know I can count on you. Sometimes I feel like.
Okay. So this next thing that I want to kind of break y'all up into some groups similar to what we just did and give you some time to practice this in a little bit of a different way. But this actually, what I'm looking at right now is the mocks and stubs lesson. So if you're more than welcome to take a look at this. The link that I just sent you all in your backend channel is the link to this repo, the user image generator. So the directions are also in this README. So y'all have access to all of this already. Again, I posted that in your channel. So you're welcome to pull this up now as we go through this. So what I want you all to do when I put you into breakout groups, again, I want everyone to be working on this kind of on your own. If you notice that you finished up early and there's still people that are working, feel free to let your group know and just say, hey, available for questions if you have any. But same way that we did it before. And I want you to just work on the first half of this. So the first half being this image generator test. So what you're going to see when you clone this down, let me go ahead and open it up here. Here it is. And so right now for this first part, and we might not even get to the user one. I really want to make sure we just at least get through the image generator test. And if we don't get to the last half of this, that's fine. This, I would say, is very similar to a kind of like a Ruby practice, those Ruby exercises that you have. Think of this repo as a Ruby exercise for mocks and stubs. So we're just going to get through at least this first image generator test as a group today. And so for this image generator test, what I have written over here is start by running this image generator test and add a test for generate images and change max size. So in this test, you already have Mocha here. Something that you might need to do if you haven't already is install that gem Mocha. So gem install Mocha you might need to do once you clone this down, but you already have it required up here. And so we have tested exist, test the attributes, just that it has a max size with what it was given upon initializing. And so this is really where I want you all to focus during this breakout time. So using Stubs, write the test to for this functionality down here. So test the generate images method. So over here in the generate images method, you are using the attribute that you've already tested exists, and that's fine. But the thing that is kind of tough with testing this is you have this randomization of that range that you passed in. So this is where I want y'all to kind of do some of your own research, see if you can figure out a way to stub this out so that you can expect, so that you know what to make for your assertion in this test. Same thing for change max size. It also has this rand here. So creating or finding a random number given the size that was passed in initially. And I want you to think of a way to write a test using mocks and stubs to be able to test it. Because right now, time's not necessarily the issue, but it's the fact that we don't really know what the random generator is going to produce for that random output of a number. So not something that we've gone over mocks, we've gone over stubs. How to test this, I kind of want to leave up to you and see if you all can figure out. So for right now, in your breakout groups, just working on this image generator test. If you happen to finish early, let your group know so that they know that you're available to kind of bounce questions and ideas off of. But any questions right now as to what I want y'all to do during, I think I'm going to shoot for about 15 minutes to let y'all be in these groups. Garrett?
Yeah, I just wanted to confirm, make sure I heard it correctly. So our goal here is to make all 4 of these tests pass, and then to create new tests for the ones the 2 that don't already have the tests created.
Yeah, so just these 2. So I created the actual method, but there's nothing in that test. So I have test generate images, test change max size. You just have to put something in here and in here. So you don't need to make any new tests, but you do need to add to the existing test to be able to test those 2 methods. Does that answer your question, Garrett?
Yep, thank you.
Yep. All right. Does anyone else have questions before I open these rooms? All right, we're going to use the same rooms as last time. Here y'all go. Okay, anyone that thinks they got this working and they would be interested in sharing their screen and kind of walking through what they were able to get done during that time? Connor, you want to share your screen?
Sure.
Cool, go ahead. Then go ahead and walk us through what you did for these 2 tests.
I am actually sharing my screen. It's not showing.
You are. I can see it. See it?
It had the wrong screen. I don't know. That's weird. It's not. There's no highlighted border. All right. So, I guess what we found out was that instead of stubs, you could stub and you change the outcome of the random, and you determine what that outcome is. And then for that, you basically you can assert what the outcome would be for that specific random outcome for generate images. That is how we approached it.
Okay, so taking a look, and I actually jumped into another group that found this similar syntax. But you can leave your screen up for right now, Connor. So it looks like on line 23 of your test, again, different syntax here, and I'll go into kind of a way to stay consistent with the syntax I've been talking about so far, but this looks like it works. Your test is passing, yes?
Yes.
Okay, so taking a look at this, line 23 in your test. So image generator.stub rand1. So you're stubbing out the method rand that's in your image generator class. And you're saying when that rand method gets called, yeah, awesome, thanks. When that rand method gets called, return 1. So this would be the same as saying image generator.stubs rand.returns 1. This is just a little bit different syntactically. So once we stub that, then you're checking to make sure that when you call generate images, since you just have rand1, that's an interesting, okay. Yeah, so you only want to go through one time. So your only element that's going to get returned in that array is image 0. So you're checking that. Cool. And then very similarly for the test change max size, you're still stubbing out rand1, which reason why we're stubbing that random out, 1, because it could be any number, and 2, because the image generator would have randomized the 2500, and that could have been truly anything between 0 and 2500. So then checking that image generator dot change max size, if we take a look over on the right to the change max size number, we're taking in that num, which in your case, back on line 32, you passed it 7. So on line 17, 7 times some random number, and you're saying you already stubbed out rand to be 1, 7 times 1 is 7, and then you make sure that that return value is actually 7. Garrett, I saw you raised your hand. Did you have a question?
Yeah, it was like a comment, and then I guess it was like a question comment. So I actually got kind of nervous at first because like a lot of people in my group were talking about using this do syntax, but like I just did it using the dot returns that we saw earlier, and it works just fine. Like,
yeah, awesome.
I guess it just kind of like how do I put this? Like, I wasn't sure why the automatic jump was to go to this do thing, because like the other one works just fine. I didn't know if there was something I was missing, or like this was easier or like more effective. So I kept trying to like rework it, and then like, yeah, the dot return, I think the dot returns just works the same way, right?
Yeah. Connor, how did you find that syntax?
That was found on Google.
Yeah.
So you're talking about rands, returns, and then you would do 1.
Yeah, like literally the same thing we did for the last example. You can just do here basically.
That was just an example that was found about mini test utilizing stub. Yeah, that was just some syntax that was used.
Because like everyone seemed to have found this do thing, and I'm like this curveball, so I was like, I didn't know what I was missing.
Right, and I think that this kind of goes back to Will. I think it was Will. You had asked earlier about like stub seems to be a method that is set aside for something else, and I responded to you by saying it's probably something syntactical, like another way of stubbing something out, and this is kind of where that comes in. But yeah, this works. I want to kind of go back to kind of the way Garrett had done it too, and walk through that once with you all. So I'll go ahead and take over sharing my screen. Thanks, Connor. And can you all see my screen all right, text editor? Yes, cool, thank you. And just to walk through this all again, for this test generate images, we're gonna need an image generator to be able to test this test generate images. And if we're taking a look at the generate images, the thing that is unpredictable here is this rand, right? That could be any number between 0 and whatever number this max image size is. So that's what we want to stub out. And kind of going back to Garrett, you had mentioned just doing it the same way we have been doing it. So image generator, although this rand is not like, it's not a method that we have defined in here, it is still a Ruby method. And this Ruby method is getting called within the image generator class, which is why we're still going to stub off of an image generator object. So image generator.stubs, and I want to stubs this rand method, and I want it to returns, let's say 2. Okay, so I just want it to return the number 2. That's a little bit easier for me to test. So when rand returns 2, then I can check to make sure, assert equal, that I get this array of image 0 and image 1 when I call image generator dot generate images. So running this test, image generator test, we can see that pass there. For the second one's similar. Same thing, we're gonna need an image generator object. And I wanna stub out, so if I take a look here at the change max size, this random max image size, that could be anything. So you can go ahead and, again, do that same thing here. Stub out random, let's say it's 2 this time. So when I call, I guess there's a few different ways we could do this. The way that Connor had it was he checked the return value of change max size. We could also kind of do the command of change max size and then check the max image size to see if it changed it. So we can do both of those things. Let's say assert equal, if we pass in a 2, or sorry, if we're saying the rand is 2, and let's say we call image generator dot change max size, and we pass it a 3. So taking a look over here, we pass it a 3. So here's a 3. The random we stubbed out to be 2. So this should return 6. So we can do it that way. I guess I didn't hit enter. And we could also then just check assert equal 6 when I call image generator dot max image size, since this method should change the max image size. And that all works. I think, Hope, you also brought up this idea of what do we do for user input? And let's say instead of having this like random number that we generate, we take it in from a user. So what I would do for that user input is put it into a different method so that you can stub out the method that you would call to get user input. So say something here like user input, and let's say this is like gets.chomp, right, to be able to get something from a user, and then I can call user input here. Oops, user input. So here I would need to wait to be able to input something, but if I'm testing this and this is reliant on a user inputting something, that's when I could stub out user input to return a number. So you could say like user input that returns 2, and now this should work accordingly as well. Curtis?
So this is partially me checking if I understand stubs correctly. Could you just stub out gets?
Could you just stub out gets?
Like do like stubs and then key gets and just like replace that with something instead of putting the method outside of your method?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So here, gets here.
Yeah, you can do that.
Is it get?
Okay.
And then stub that out. You could.
Yeah.
The thing with that is I would expect in your application that you probably take multiple user inputs, and then you can just keep restubbing that method if you pulled it out into a separate one.
Oh, okay.
So sometimes it's helpful to just pull it out. What questions do y'all have right now on these examples that we just did, or mocks and stubs in general?
This is kind of a small one, but why is it that when it was using like the do, like stub, rand, comma one, why was that stub, and why is it when you're using returns, is it stubs plural?
Yeah, I'm not too sure. I think it really just comes down to how you are choosing to write this syntactically. I think when you pass it, when you do something, we could also say image generator dot stub. I think anytime that you put it in the same argument, you have to use stub instead of stubs. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this class, there's like a ton of different ways to do this, which is why I just showed you one, because just find one way that works for you. But there's a lot of different versions that still work. And I'm not positive on this, but I think it's just left over from another method that was created in different versions of Ruby that are still left. Zach?
For the case of when you have like user input and like random, like how do you know when to use like a reader for user input, or just act the same way that rand does?
We kind of lost you a little bit. I think, I'm not sure if
Okay,
your headphones are going on.
can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah,
Okay,
can you say it one
cool.
more time?
Yeah. So with like in the instance of user input, like how do you know when to use the colon symbol? And then same with like rand. Would I have to make like an instance variable for user input?
This colon, you only need to use if you are referencing a method, which you will be when you're stubbing something out.
Okay.
I'm not sure if did that answer your question, Zach?
Yeah, so I wouldn't have to make like an instance variable, for example, like we had in like the max image size. Okay.
Correct. Yep. All right, y'all. Again, you can kind of treat this repo like a Ruby exercises practice for mocks and stubs. And also, again, this is not essential to moving on to Mod 2, but it is something we want you all to feel like you've seen and that you could give a very brief definition of mocks and or stubs. And as you go throughout your time at Turing, stubbing things out will become a lot more useful as you get into more expensive code. And that way you have at least seen it. And I think coming up on this next project, you all will definitely find some uses for it as well. Garrett, last question, and then we'll kind of end here so you have a little break.
Yeah, so I know you've mentioned a couple of times that this isn't like essential information for moving on to Mod 2. Does that mean that like it's not, like is this fair game for like material that would be on an independent challenge, or?
It could be, yeah.
Okay.
It's so like your independent challenges don't go towards promotion, just as for you to practice, but it would not be something that would be on an assessment.
Okay.
Yes. Cool. All right, y'all, I'll wrap up this recording, get it put up to YouTube, and we'll go ahead and end here. And you have PD with Kat at 3 o'clock. I'll see y'all later.
Thanks, Meg.
Thanks, Meg.
Yeah, bye.
Thank you.
You're welcome.